No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
Here's some shard plate. But also, you can do whatever you want. But here's some shard plate. I'm Stephen Pond.
And I'm Ben Jeppsen.
Welcome to The Next Ideal,
a Stormlight self-help podcast. Welcome to episode 15. I can't believe we're this far into it. It's been a few months, but we're making some headway into this book.
Indeed. We're all the way up to chapter 18 at this point, well through part 2. Chapter 18 is back to Adolin, who has been tasked with investigating the torn and or maybe cut leather strap from Elokar's saddle. Adolin's on a date, and it's terrible.
Adolin clearly is someone who he has options. I'll put it that way. Adolin has options because he doesn't seem to try very hard on these dates.
The advantage of being hot.
He's taking his date on this investigation, meeting with the leather workers, and they're looking at the strap and to see if it was cut or torn. And Adolin is convinced that this was just a break of the leather, but they say, no, this was definitely cut. We can see that it's been cut, and it sounds very shady at this point.
Until maybe it's not, because apparently leather can get pinched or caught under a buckle or something, and that can just accidentally happen. So, still unconclusive.
He's almost relieved, right? When he's like, oh, wait, well, so it's probably just cut by the buckle. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, there's still a lot potentially going on here. So he takes his date to church.
Yep. He specifically says, what religion is romantic, eternal love and all that. But for as eligible a bachelor as Adolin is, man, he has terrible ideas as to how to court women.
But he hasn't ever had to work to learn how, right? Like, it's the proverbial teach a man to fish, right? The fish just hop up on the shore for him. He never has had to learn what it means to bait a hook.
I guess so, yeah.
I don't know, maybe that's a terrible metaphor. But we do talk about fish in the sea, right? And
And Adolin is surrounded by fish.
We are skipping ahead in the chapter a little bit here, but it's continuity of Adolin's date. I did enjoy the further revelation about Vorinism as a religion and the devotees and churches as he's speaking with Kadash about his own glory and his failure to advance as a consequence of his father preventing him from dueling. Mm-hmm. At first glance, this is actually a really cool system of where religion is encouraging people to pursue their strengths and set specific goals. Like, the religion is explicitly facilitating personal growth through effective goal setting and motivating you to pursue them. And I think that's a pretty cool system that they have there with all these different options. You find, working at a university, helping students find their vocation is a really important part of what I do. And it seems like that's kind of what they're doing here is you need to find what you're good at and how you can serve Roshar and advance, and don't settle for wherever you're at. Grow that talent, grow that strength, a religion of self-actualization. That's what it seems like.
I love being able to compare Adolin's experience with Dalinar's experience, though, because we get both of their perspectives on Vorinism. Adolin goes to the Vorin temple and talks with an Ardent, who is a priest, and specifically says, hey, let's work on your calling you haven't elevated.
That's right, yes.
You haven't elevated recently because you can't duel, and that's your chosen calling. But let's see what we can do. Let's work on some goals. With Dalinar, he says his chosen calling was to be a leader, and his glory was determination. So with the distinction between calling and glory, a calling is your profession, and the glory is specifically an attribute of the Almighty to emulate.
Interesting.
Which I think is a really interesting way to approach that. So Dalinar is a leader as his calling, which makes sense. He's a high prince, and his chosen glory is determination. But it specifically says he'd chosen both in his youth, though he now viewed them differently than he once had. And so that, again, is a value of this system where you can choose these specific things. I mean, I'm not sure if you get locked into a specific calling. No, you obviously don't, because Kadash was a soldier and switched his calling to be in the Ardentia.
you're starting over, right? You have to start over and elevating in, but yeah, you can change.
Now I'm curious, did Kadash choose a different glory when he changed from being a soldier to being an ardent?
Does it tell us what his glory was?
It does not. So,
you know, but like you think about determination, if my calling is soldier and I'm going to fight with determination, I could similarly approach Ardentia with determination. That's an interesting question.
And that's why I like what Dalinar says here is he chose them in his youth, but he views them differently now. And so you have that same concept of determination, but as you grow and progress in your life, that means different things. That is exactly the same as what we do in our lives. I mean, we don't have specifically a calling and a glory, but we learn those concepts early in life of like kindness and honesty and these things that mean very concrete things as a child. But as we grow, they become more nuanced and more meaningful in our lives as we incorporate them.
I think ideally in this system, as you're learning these ideas, and ideally in our own system, it is strengths-based. And that's where sometimes, though, it isn't always the case, right? Particularly with children, if what they're constantly hearing is a focus on weaknesses, they can become to identify with their weaknesses, and they might choose a calling and a glory, even metaphorically, in response to that. That's where the idea of an inferiority complex comes from. That's from Alfred Adler, argues that everybody experiences inferiority, everybody experiences weakness, and the way that we strive to be better in our lives is a response to those things that make us feel inferior. That's not pathological. It's just that's human development. But I can see that in a very negative way. Somebody says, you're a very determined person, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be determined. But on the other hand, I can remember growing up and hearing my mom, I was the youngest of 7 kids, and my mom telling my brothers and sisters to stop giving Ben such a hard time. He's sensitive. And I took that to heart. Guys, I'm sensitive. Stop it. But I do have a very different thought about that now as I reflect on choosing a career like therapy and as a psychologist, to be sensitive to others. That's interesting.
It feels like we're naturally going back to Renarin here with the concept of the inferiority complex, because when just moving on through what happens in the chapter, we shift to Dalinar walking up to the king's palace with Renarin, and he's talking with a scribe about the logistics of running the war camps. Eventually, they shift to just a private conversation between Dalinar and Renarin, where Dalinar talks about what happened during the Chasm Fiend hunt, where Renarin, basically unarmed, having a side sword, but no armor, no other protection, rushes out and wants to help. And Dalinar says, no, get out of the way, you'll die.
Dalinar's not wrong.
Yeah.
You can't be coming out after a Chasm Fiend with a simple sword. But how about Renarin's courage here in this moment? That's impressive. I mean, even Sadeas with his shard plate, well, I don't think that's a fair comparison. I was going to say, because he goes back to a shard bow, but he is retrieving a weapon. He's not fleeing. I'll cut him some slack. But I think it's impressive that Renarin is going towards the conflict to help. It can be hard to give praise in that situation.
Yeah.
Dalinar does say, I don't question your bravery, but it was a very smart thing to do.
Yeah, I don't fault your bravery. I fault your wisdom. Especially from Dalinar's perspective. He's had years of training in fighting and military action and has gone on multiple Chasm Fiend hunts specifically. So Dalinar knows what he's doing. Renarin does not have that experience, especially comparing him to his brother, Adolin. Adolin has combat experience, significant combat experience. Renarin, because of this blood weakness, has not had much experience fighting even with that side sword that he has, but he still rushes out to try and help. So bravery, absolutely, but awareness of ability, maybe not.
Yeah, Renarin, he lacks the experience to really know that wasn't a good move, but very brave. And yet his assessment of the situation is heartbreaking. Perhaps the monster would have swept me off the plateau, and I would no longer be such a useless drain on everyone's time. That's not just theater. Yeah. That's not just a dramatic statement. I can think of specific clients that I've had who sound very similar. I mean, that this is someone who genuinely feels not worthless, but useless.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting contrast between Renarin and Kaladin, where Kaladin we see has impressive capability, but feels worthless. And Renarin is in a higher position of status, but lacks that capability. It's basically someone who has clinical depression, who has something going on emotionally that is making them feel these certain ways. And then Renarin is more someone who has a chronic illness, where emotionally they're not experiencing what Kaladin is experiencing, but because of their physical capability, they're feeling more limited and less able to contribute in a meaningful way.
And that limitation on its own wouldn't lead to these feelings.
Yeah.
That limitation is occurring in a context that leads to those feelings. And so when I was reading through this chapter, people think of Sigmund Freud as Freud was the first to develop a system of psychotherapy and had all these wacky ideas. And the humanists were this group of philosophical psychologists and psychiatrists who said, you know what, we don't think life really is all about sex and death. And we think that there is actually a human tendency towards goodness and self-actualization and achieving our potential. Very much similar to what the devotees are talking about with Vorinism. And Carl Rogers argued that if allowed to, we will naturally progress towards the best version of ourselves. But the need to belong, the need to feel not just loved, but a sense of belonging and to be valued and prized is a more potent need, a more fundamental need than the need to self-actualize. Most people have heard of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so the need to belong is more foundational. It's lower on the pyramid of those hierarchy of needs. And so consequently, if forced to choose between becoming the best version of myself or belonging, human beings will naturally do whatever it takes to belong. Rogers argued that mental illness is not rooted within an individual. It's rooted within a community. If a community sets up conditional worth, if they say these are the conditions that you have to meet in order to be worthy of love and worthy of being valued and prized, then that will create incongruence, a disconnect within the self where we will start to idealize a version of us that is not us. And that's what we see here with Renarin, where he is, I am useless if I'm not a soldier. And who can blame him as a Kholin? As Dalinar Kholins, I should say, because there are some incredible women in the Kholin family that demonstrate other incredible ways to contribute in Yasna's intelligence and research. And, well, we haven't met Aunt Navani and her contributions yet, so we'll leave those off to the side. But as a man in the Kholin family, there's really only one way to be all that you can be.
And we've seen that with Kaladin's flashbacks as well. As a man in the Alethi culture, soldiers are prized. That's the most valuable calling. I mean, they specifically say, yeah, farmers are second best, but soldiers are called after this life to go battle the Voidbringers in the Tranquilin halls. Like, being a soldier is the most valuable thing in Alethi society. And the fact that Renarin, because of a physical limitation, is not able to do that, specifically with the rest of his family, with Dalinar and Adolin and Elokar, everyone else being very martially full of prowess, Renarin can't get there. And just culturally, that places less value on him.
We were talking earlier about how the religion says, find what you're best at. And Dalinar says, fighting's not the only thing of value a man can do. The Ardents were very specific about that. But then, to the point you just made, yes, the highest calling of men was to join a battle in the afterlife to reclaim the Tranquiline halls. But the Almighty accepted the excellence of any man or woman, regardless of what they did. It almost feels like when your mom or dad says, I don't care what all the other kids say about you, you're special.
That hurts in a very deep and uncomfortable place for some reason.
We see right through that, right? Dalinar's sitting here trying to say, son, I love you no matter what, but I could get you some shard plate. His words are, you don't have to be a soldier, but his actions say, but it would help you if you were.
Right.
And there's this notion that the Almighty will accept all callings, but some callings are more equal than others. It's very much a culture that has set up this conditional worth that tells Renarin, unless you change fundamentally who you are, you will never truly belong. And that's what's so interesting about Carl Rogers' theory of psychology. You know, it's funny because here we are, we're doing this and we're calling it a self-help podcast. And that implies that we can help ourselves. And Rogers argues that in many ways, we can't help ourselves in these types of situations because human beings are fundamentally driven by connection. And so the solution has to be an authentic relationship with someone who will accept you no matter what you do. He argued that in psychotherapy, our job was to create a relationship with unconditional positive regard, genuine empathy, while being genuine and authentic myself as the counselor, and the client being genuine and authentic themselves. And he said, as long as that relationship exists, that is sufficient for change in a person. But it's a relationship is the answer. And so I can see Dalinar trying to do that, but his actions are contradiction. And I feel bad to fault him for offering the plate, though, because at the same time, I'm like, this is a father trying to help his son. And what greater gift can you give them than shards? I mean, that is a treasure. But this tension here is very difficult to kind of manage.
It's tough because they're both functioning in the constraints of Alethi society. If Renarin was born in any other country on Roshar, we haven't learned a lot about other cultures, but we're mostly focused on Alethkar. But if he was anywhere else where it wasn't such a warlike martial culture, Renarin would be excellent in any other profession. But because there's such a huge expectation and value placed on soldiership in Alethkar specifically, he feels he can't do anything else. And Dalinar recognizes that feeling in Renarin, seeing that he values being a soldier and tries to push him toward that in the best way that he can. So they're both being pointed in less than healthy, helpful directions because of the culture that they are in.
Recognizing the constraints that Dalinar does have around him, it does make it easier to see that he genuinely does love Renarin.
Yeah.
And he doesn't need Renarin to be a soldier. He doesn't. He also recognizes, though, that Renarin exists in this culture as well. Mm-hmm. And so within that culture, this is the best thing I can do to help you, while simultaneously also communicating you can be something different. But it's so hard to hear that message sometimes.
Yeah. Something interesting, specifically going back to Kadash, Adolin says he was formerly a soldier and then changed to be an Ardent. What societally must have been the implications of that, where Kadash previously had this elite, like Adolin says he was an officer, I believe, not just a soldier, but he was in leadership. And then he left the most prized calling and went to the Ardentia, who are functionally slaves. They are owned by Dalinar, because we find out a little bit about the hierarchy and everything that went on with the ancient Vorin church. But Kadash would be an interesting case study because he was top tier in terms of Vorin value and then left that and became a slave. He must have had some really impressive value that he was following to make that choice, to make that shift.
I'm sure there were men who called him a coward.
Yeah.
Because to this point, it doesn't seem any real mental health treatment for men who experience trauma in the battlefield. Mm-hmm. Nothing effective. And I mean, he clearly saw some difficult stuff in battle. For him to have made that change, that must have really challenged his sense of who he was, and thinking, what we're doing is not who I want to be. This is not the calling, that I want to have. Even as some certainly must have called him a coward, that actually, to make such a move that's so frowned upon is the right word, but to make such a move that would be seen as a demotion by so many, it takes a ton of courage to do something like that.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about a few episodes ago, the difference between moral courage and physical courage. Kadash making that shift, absolutely moral courage. But then here with Dalinar and Renarin, Dalinar is encouraging physical courage in Renarin by getting him shards and downplaying the moral courage that he had on the battlefield already.
100%. As I've been listening to our episodes myself, your interesting is my 100%. I'm trying to cut that one down. So we've talked about Yalb, who I'm trying to think of some of these other side characters that I would love to have more detail on.
Ishik
was another. Yeah, there's so many of these characters that when you see them inside their culture, I would love to hear more of Kadash's history and how he made that choice.
Raffo.
Let's go back to Dalinar and Renarin. They were walking to the top of the palace, or well, not a palace, but it's the war home for Elhokar. What did they call it? It's Elhokar's home, his base.
I think they do call it a palace. Dalinar specifically says he doesn't have a palace. Dalinar has a bunker, but yes. I think it is just the palace.
It's certainly been furnished as one. Dalinar notices that this is not. It isn't a war bunker for Elhokar, for sure. He has brought his amenities, but as they are there chatting with him, there's some interesting psychologically rich things that Elhokar says and Dalinar reflects on. Mm-hmm. And the first that I picked up on that I wanted to talk about was, he says, the past is irrelevant. I only look forward. And Dalinar questions whether he believes either of those things. Uh-huh. It's interesting the way the way Elhokar puts it. I'm with Dalinar here. The past is definitely not irrelevant. It's how we got to wherever we are, right? Mm-hmm. And to only look forward seems unwise. To use, I question the wisdom rather than the bravery. Nevertheless, there are some interesting therapy approaches that kind of adopt this mantra. We've talked about the difficulty of diagnosis before, right? Where when we diagnose depression, we're diagnosing the symptoms, runny nose, fever, and a cough. We're not diagnosing a cause. And what's truly causing somebody's symptoms of depression in many ways can never really be known. It's a hypothetical construct, right? And so there's an approach to psychotherapy called solutions-focused therapy that's been growing over the last 20 or 30 years. And the idea is we can't know a lot about the past. In fact, the research on eyewitness testimony is that we're terrible at it. Uh-huh. It's the gold standard of evidence in a legal system, but we're terrible at it. And so our recollection of the past is very biased. And so it says how you broke your leg is kind of irrelevant to repairing it. You need to get it set, you need to put a cast around it or a splint, and you need to stay off it for a while, and it will heal, regardless of whether you broke it falling down the stairs or jumping on the trampoline. And that's kind of the approach, is wherever this came from, we will never know. But if we look at the future, we can treat it. We can come up with a solution. And so that's what, Elhokar sounds like a solutions-focused therapist. Like, you know what? Whatever happened, we got to move forward and we're going to stay focused on the future. I think he's a little extreme in that perspective, but I do think there are some things that we can apply, right, from a self-help perspective. One of the approaches from that mindset that can be helpful, which is, I think, a better balance of Dalinar and Elhokar's perspective, is in looking at the past, instead of looking at the times when we're feeling down, this therapy says, let's not talk about when you have felt depressed or when you have felt anxious. Instead, let's talk about the times when you didn't. What were the circumstances surrounding the exceptions? They call that exception talk. We're going to focus on the times you felt good. And how can we replicate those? How can we recreate those moments where you felt good? It kind of flips on its head, the focus of psychotherapy and talking to people. It's not just look on the bright side. It says, let's just focus on trying to increase the bright side moments, to increase those moments when you felt joy, even if they are very, very rare. It's kind of a cool idea.
Yeah, it's not just looking on the bright side. It's analyzing how the bright side occurs, and then setting up circumstances so the bright side can occur more often.
That's a really good distinction, because we're not trying to ignore, but it's a recognition that often we're so focused on the hole that we miss all the dirt that we have to fill that hole.
Yeah,
it's refocusing. Let's focus on the potential solutions we have to solve a problem. We're not ignoring the problem, but we're focused on the solutions. It's just a different way of thinking, and it can help people. Sometimes I'll shift into solutions focused when working with someone who gets trapped in rumination and these cycles of just negative thinking, and then therapy just reinforces those ruminating thoughts because we just keep talking about those things. And that paradigm shift can be helpful.
It reminds me of learning to ride a motorcycle. And this sounds weird, but there is a point. When you're riding a motorcycle or when you're riding a bike, or even this concept came up, I was really interested in doing parkour when I had a younger body. But when you're learning to do those things, but we'll say riding a bike, when you're steering and there's an obstacle in front of you, if there's like a pothole, if there's a rock or something on the road in front of you, the way you avoid hitting the rock or pothole is by focusing on the space next to it rather than focusing on the actual obstacle. Because if you are looking at the rock in the road, you're going to hit the rock in the road. And that's bringing it down to a more basic level. That's what this is in life, if you're focusing on the rocks or the potholes or the things that are going to trip you up as you're steering your bike down the road of life, that's what you're going to hit. And solutions-based therapy sounds like it's recognizing that there are potholes, sure, but making sure we're focusing on what can we do to steer the bike of our life on the path that will avoid those, focusing on the space that is safe rather than the thing that is dangerous.
Absolutely. And I love the metaphor of the bike, because in addition, the only way a bike stays upright is with that forward momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's how you create that balance, by shifting the inertia, moving forward. And that is very much what we're trying to do here. Funnily, now that I think about Elhokar's statement, Dalinar's argument to withdraw from the war seems to make more sense if you're ignoring the past and just focusing on the future.
That's very true.
Right? Like, what are we doing? If we just, okay, we've been here for 6 years. If we forget the past and think what strategically is the best move for the Alethi nation, is it to stay out here with all of our armies away from our borders, eating soulcast food, and who knows what's happening in Alakar? Maybe leaving some armies to collect gem hearts that belong to the king and send back is a good idea, but is having everybody out here all at once, is this really what's good for our future?
There's some fundamental issues with Elhokar that we will see more as we progress, but I'm going to cut that.
I think it's a convenient philosophy. It's something that he will cite. It's a kind of thing that you bring up to win an argument, but not something he actually lives by.
Yeah. In that conversation, there's immediate hypocrisy.
Yes. From there, they're talking about the Parshendi. Dalinar is trying to explore the past. Why, if we could understand why they attacked Gavilar, it would help us win the war. It would help us reach peace, help us to understand how to interact with them. He's seeking understanding, which is a really important thing to do in a war. If you can understand your enemy, you're going to be more effective against them, but also just in terms of cooperation. And Elhokar just says this heartless line. He says, a cultural misunderstanding would imply that they have a culture, primitive brutes. And he goes on, who knows why a horse kicks or an axe hound bites, completely dehumanizing the Parshendi. This is something that people do to help them make themselves feel better about violence against others, right? When we dehumanize others, it's okay to treat them as less human, and it's okay to take advantage or hurt them. And it's really at the root of historic racism and all sorts of prejudice.
Not only that, I mean, I've seen that in daily interaction. When we dehumanize individuals, not quite dehumanize, but de-agentify, which isn't a word, depersonify. If we ignore other people's personhood and other people's agency and ability to make their own choices, then we are able to justify not liking or acting against them in certain ways.
Dalinar's response reminds me of another one of my favorite books, where he says, actually, we never really understood them. He's thinking it. He says, we never really understood them. I guess that's the crux of the problem. And he's absolutely right. Now, in a previous episode, you have mentioned Ender's Game.
Uh-huh.
Did you read the rest of the books in that series, or just the first?
I read Ender's Game and then just emotionally felt like, I need a break from all of this. So I have the rest of them on my shelf, but I have not read them yet.
They are much deeper psychologically series than Ender's Game itself.
Mm-hmm.
Orson Scott Card, actually, the book he wanted to write was the sequel, Speaker for the Dead, and Ender's Game was written specifically to allow him to write Speaker for the Dead. He needed that story to finish so that he could tell the story of Speaker for the Dead. And That story is a book about empathy, individual empathy, but also this kind of cross-cultural empathy that Dalinar is thinking about and Elhokar is ignoring. And there's a great quote from Speaker for the Dead. And this explains, it has to do with why Ender is so good at battle planning. And it's because of his empathy. Anyway, before I read the quote, a little bit of context from the book. Due to the events of Ender's Game and then time dilation through space travel, right? When you're traveling at the speed of light, funny things happen with time. We'll just put it that way. And so a character has been gone for thousands of years on Earth. And a new religion starts based on the events of Ender's Game. And there's a book that was written called Speaker for the Dead at the end of Ender's Game, and it is now the holy book for this religion. And people, instead of, when somebody dies, instead of inviting a pastor or a priest to come and do a eulogy, they might invite a speaker. And the speaker's job is to go and spend like a month with the family and the community and learn everything they can about that person, and then tell their story, but the whole story, not just the highlights. The whole story of who this person is. So that's the context for this quote. In this quote, it says, once you understand what people really want, you can't hate them anymore. You can fear them, but you can't hate them because you can always find the same desires in your own heart. When you really know somebody, you can't hate them. Or maybe it's just that you can't really know them until you stop hating them. And that's what the theme of this whole book is about. There's a character who was hated in the community. He was abusive. He was a drunk. He was problematic. And somebody calls for a speaker at this man's death. And then that speaker tells the story, an uncomfortable story that the community didn't want to hear, about a boy who was bullied as a child, neglected as a teen, and becomes this awful person who does not, like, the goal is not to endorse or encourage sympathy for bad behavior, but to understand better how that happens. It does this intergalactically as well and creates really interesting, this like cross-cultural empathy of where we have conflicts like we do with the Parshendi. And the crux of the problem is we simply don't understand one another. And instead we dehumanize one another to justify killing each other.
I'm trying to turn that inward, which is really strange because I've experienced many times in my life where I have hated myself. Does that mean that in those moments of self-hatred, I just simply have not extended understanding toward myself? Because you could very easily argue that no one would know my situation better than me, because I have lived my own experience. And so no one could understand it better than myself. But how does that work when there are moments of self-hatred?
I would say that's a really great insight and connection, because no one would know yourself better than you, except we are our worst critics. We give less space for forgiveness to ourselves than we do to others in most cases. In other cases, we like, there's a tribalism here, right? Without groups, we don't give them, right? That's exactly what we're talking about, this cross-cultural empathy problem. But within groups, with our friends, we're very forgiving. We're very understanding, right? A really common pop psychology thing that you'll see on Instagram somewhere, but it's also true, is this idea that you should treat yourself the way you would treat somebody who's going through a hard time, right? We put our arm around them and we say, what can I do to help? But I don't deserve that, but others do. We're very incriminating. And yes, I would 100% agree that this is why psychotherapy can be such a powerful tool, because even though I know my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, I don't always understand the circumstances that can lead to them. We often will take personal responsibility for the power of the situation. Instead of giving ourselves forgiveness, we will say, man, I'm just the worst. And we will hold ourselves to these high standards of perfection. And sometimes it takes a different person to say, I wonder if this situation is what led to those behaviors. Now, that's not to say, again, that you had no choice, but I can understand how you got there. And maybe you could understand that as well, and then find those choices, those micro choices. We talk about micro choices all the time, but sometimes we don't even notice the micro choices we make in response to the bully's response to negative experiences with others around us that lead us to make these micro choices. You know, I've talked about the learned helplessness with dogs, right? And the dogs could have gotten out, but they did learn to be helpless, and that learning wasn't their fault. So they do make a choice to sit and take the shocks instead of escaping quite easily. But it's not their fault for not for the learned helplessness. There's this weird balancing of responsibility and fault that we often will incriminate ourselves.
Yeah.
And it takes someone to seek that understanding first, to care about us enough to try and understand us in a way to help us then understand ourselves and give ourselves permission to change.
It's giving permission, but also it's allowing recognition of context.
Yes.
And often that's one of the reasons why we are so critical of ourselves and more forgiving of others, is when we are outside of the situation, when someone else is having a hard time, we can say, but look, context. This happened, this happened, this happened. Those things aren't your fault. So you shouldn't feel guilty or beat yourself up about what is going on. With ourselves, we sort of can't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
Where because we are the main character in our own story, we are deeply involved in situations that can be harmful to ourselves and others. It's harder to see that context and how we ended up in those situations. So that external perspective gives us additional context that we can use to understand ourselves better.
I think that context is a far better word than permission, because one of the other things that we've talked about in previous episodes is that we have a lot of coping skills that are understandable where they come from to help us cope, but they aren't always adaptive, right? And so there becomes this really difficult balance of not wanting to blame myself. I want to understand the context, but also taking responsibility to make a new choice.
Yeah.
Because I do have a new choice. I just didn't see it before. And I shouldn't be mad at myself for not making a choice I wasn't aware of. I can be okay with that, but simultaneously saying, but now that I'm aware of it, I should make it. And that's where a lot of that self-blame will come from, is then we will say, well, I should have known better. I should have done differently. And so awareness of context, I think that's a really great way to put it, that when we are willing to recognize the context in our own lives and give ourselves that space to understand where things happened, so I don't need to kick myself while I'm down, but simultaneously now try and learn from it to make a different choice. And so with all of that context, I think it's a really great way to turn this idea of feeling empathy for other cultures and people who are different and being willing to make contact with them and seek understanding to better understand their behaviors. We have to do that with ourselves as well.
Speaking of different contexts and other cultures, let's move on to Dalinar's vision.
Yes. They're starting this long trek back from the palace on the hill, and Renarin says, Dad,
here comes a high storm.
We weren't planning for this. We got to get there because weird things happen to you during high storms.
They gallop down the hill. Dalinar tries to make it to the Kholin family storm shelter. They are too far away. He has to go into just this smaller community shelter, which, just to point out a little bit about Dalinar's character and who he is, not just as an individual, but as a leader. It specifically says no one in Dalinar's war camp has to pay to go into these storm shelters. No one has to pay to be protected during these regular cataclysmic events. And so they make it into this storm shelter, and the storm wall hits, and everything goes black for Dalinar, and he wakes up in a different place.
He wakes up, he's in a
barn.
Yes, a barn.
Yep.
And he hears a whimpering voice somewhere nearby and senses and hears something menacing somewhere around. Trying to put myself in his shoes, how is discombobulating? Is that the right word this would be?
Yeah.
Disorienting. That's how disorienting to just wake up in this moment.
This, again, is it's just Dalinar. Everyone else in this vision, we have no context for. Later on in the vision, when Dalinar asks, like, what year is it? What country are we in? They say they're in Alethala, which is the prehistoric version of the country of Alethkar. And they're in the 8th epic. And all of these things place us very, very far in the past. And so Dalinar is our main connection to what is happening in this vision. And so we learn so much more about the character of Dalinar and how he faces adversity in this chapter.
First off, we see he's a pretty incredible fighter.
Yeah.
And one of the more humorous elements of this is he is in this vision, but to everyone else in the vision, they're responding to him as if he is this father, right?
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly Dad is this awesome fighter. Like the wife, she's like, when did you learn how to do that? It's just completely throwing off everything as he fends off these midnight essences with a poker. But to your point, we learned about him, how he is, even though he knows it's not real, he is going to save this child.
Yep.
And he will protect this woman.
Yeah.
And there's some nobility there. That's really incredible.
I love it. It says, but every instinct, every shred of honor he had drove him to step to the side, placing himself between the woman and the beasts. Vision, memory, or delusion, he could not stand aside. Which Dalinar, as a human, is awesome. Like, he knows this is not real. He knows this isn't actually happening to him. He's aware that outside of this vision, people are having to hold him down because he is acting out everything that's going on and speaking and babbling ununderstandably.
Incomprehensibly.
Thank you. But even acknowledging that, he still cannot let himself allow other people to come to harm when he could do something.
He really has this courage and nobility and this sense of responsibility. There's one moment in this battle with the midnight essences that struck me as not just moral so much that we're talking about right now, but healthy and something we can learn from. He's been fighting this thing. He gets knocked off his feet. And it says, dizzy, Dalinar forced himself to his feet and fell into his stance. Always keep the stance. And so, he's overlearned these skills. He's well trained so that in moments of distress, his automatic response is to get into a strong, balanced stance so that he can be flexible in defending himself. It reminds me of my middle school basketball years, learning to play basketball. And they would teach us the triple threat position, that if you held the ball right here on your hip, you could dribble, pass, or shoot right away. That's what I thought of. It's okay, I'm in my stance that I can do anything I need to. That makes me more capable of responding to whatever's happening around me. When we're talking about our psychology and our mental health, there's something similar about a psychological stance that we can take in moments of stress or anxiety that can help us to respond to our world more flexibly. One of the things we've talked about a lot in the 14 previous episodes that we've had, never by name, but I've talked a lot about different principles related to it, is called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a very cool psychotherapy. It's more recent. It's in the last 30. It's been around for 30 or 40 years, but that's relatively young. It's not a century old yet. It was developed as a response to traditional psychotherapies that reinforced this idea of normality, that everybody needs to calm down and stop having symptoms, that you should focus on getting rid of those negative thoughts or focus on getting rid of these negative emotions. Be normal was the definition of mental health. Stephen Hayes created this approach as a response to that, saying, you know what? It's actually pretty normal to feel anxious. It's pretty normal to feel depressed sometimes. Like, humans go through periods of feeling these difficult emotions. And a psychotherapy that embraces a holistic and human definition of mental health shouldn't try to stop those things from happening, because that's like saying a healthy human never gets a cold, right? That's silly. And so that's where acceptance and commitment therapy comes from, where he says that instead we need to have a psychological stance that we fall back on that is ready when these thoughts come, and we let them happen, accept them. So he developed it from his own panic disorder. He had a panic disorder, and his whole life was oriented around trying to stop panic attacks from happening, until he realized nothing I do is going to stop these panic attacks from coming. What if instead I learned how to not orient? He was like, I'm tired of orienting my life around my panic attacks. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not going and doing anything. What if I just said, okay, when a panic attack happens, I'm going to be ready and I'm going to write it out. And then I'm going to keep living my life according to things that actually matter to me. And that's where commitment comes from. And so you can see a lot of it, like with Kaladin and with Shallan and with these stories and with Dalinar, is like, okay, things are happening. I'm going to deal with them as they come, but I'm going to live my life according to ideals, according to my values. And it's this very cool, flexible, leans into mindfulness meditation. is that's where a lot of the treatment is learning how to receive feelings, let them come and let them go. And that's what I think of when I see Dalinar in this moment. Get in the stance, the crap is going down all around me, and I will be ready and flexible to respond to this. And then I will live my life. I will continue to live my life accordingly.
There are different stances that Dalinar takes in this combat, though. He starts off in smoke stance, where he's more used to, I think it is stone stance. They mention several different stances, and I think that is psychologically applicable as well. Like, there's not just one thing that we can do that will be best for every situation. Dalinar's fighting Midnight Essence with a poker instead of a shard blade. So he consciously changes his stance to be more appropriate to that situation. He's still in a stance, because that is vital. Having basically a home base where you can go back to ground yourself and be ready for incoming chaos of life. But being able to shift your stance depending on what is coming at you. It's not just flexibility in what's going on with combat, it's flexibility in how you approach combat and how you're able to receive the chaos of your life.
Absolutely. And so that's where we have our home base that is flexible and ready to respond. And I think he would agree that, like, when a panic attack comes, then I shift into wind stance or smoke stance, whatever it is that's going to be most effective in dealing with that panic attack, and then come back to my home base and continue my life. And if I'm feeling anxious or if I feel a depressive episode coming, then I shift my stance and I'm ready. I've developed coping skills and I have a plan for how to respond to that, to let it come and let it go. Whereas the opposite, this idea that we should be eliminating all of those negative emotions and negative thoughts from our life, that would be like Dalinar spending the rest of his life looking around every corner for midnight essences. I'm just going to make sure that those midnight essences never come, instead of moving forward. And then when they show up, I deal with them in that flexible way. Like you said, shifting my stance to the most effective way to respond and cope with whatever the world is bringing at me.
That sounds like Elokar, looking around every corner for assassins.
Yes, absolutely. But the thing I love about this approach, though, is it redefines what healthy living is. That I'm going to feel anxiety, and I don't need to stop it. And there will be times that I feel depressed, and I don't necessarily need to stop that either. It doesn't mean I'm crazy. It doesn't mean I'm abnormal. But that these are human emotions that people feel. They're uncomfortable. They're not something to be sought out, and they're not something necessarily I should celebrate. But they're things that I can ride through, I can adapt, but I'm going to orient my life around the things that actually matter to me, not orienting my life around decreasing my symptoms.
But going back to what Dalinar is doing, the reason why he's able to get back into stance and always keep the stance, he has immense training in fighting and different stances. We should take that same approach of practicing getting into stance, making sure we know where that home base is mentally and emotionally. And when chaos and setbacks in life come, consciously resetting ourselves back into stance. And that will get easier and easier as we practice it. It's that overlearned skill. That's why Dalinar is able to do it in the chaos of this fight against creatures he's never seen before. But because he has overlearned those stances, he's able to protect himself and those around him. It's practice, it's training.
And I think the psychological version of that, it's engaging in our coping skills, finding those personally meaningful relationships and activities and engaging in them so that they become automatic. From an ACT perspective, it's mindfulness training, mindfulness and meditation, and training yourself to make my initial reaction to stress be slow breathing. Like that's that first step, to slow my breathing, and that helps to clear the mind, right? And to develop automatic overlearned responses that are healthy, adaptive coping skills. Kind of circling back to what we were talking about 10 minutes ago, that it's understandable for people to do things that aren't really adaptive when we're really, really stressed out. It's hard, right? Our attention focuses and we get tunnel vision, and it can be really hard. And so if we can overlearn adaptive, healthy coping skills, if we can overlearn reaching out to trusted friends as needed, and overlearn slow breathing mindfulness activities, so that that's our immediate response when we start to feel stressed, it's going to put us in a better position to respond.
There's a lot of other things going on in this chapter. There's a lot of lore. There's a lot of insight into the history of Roshar and the Knights Radiant that we won't get into. But the concept of resetting your stance and getting back into a position where you are able to affect the outcomes of your life because you are grounded and aware. That's the most impressive part of this chapter to me, but also that's, I think, the most difficult to implement part of this chapter.
I think it's impressive, and in part, it's important to remember that Dalinar didn't learn that skill alone.
That's very true.
He went to mentors, and he had training, and he met with people, and they taught him these skills. And I think that's where it can be really valuable if we're willing, it's to not hold ourselves accountable to learn those skills all on our own, but to reach out and develop them, sometimes with professionals.
Mm-hmm. You said this is a self-help podcast, but a lot of the things that we encourage people to do is not just rely on yourself, but develop those relationships and rely on others to get the help and support that you need.
The best way to help yourself is to ask.
Yeah. And the best way to ask, specifically in the Cosmere community, if you are a fan of these books and a fan of this podcast, there is that next step coin. There is Nerd HQ that can provide the help. All you need to do is ask. You don't need to pay. You just need to ask for the help that you need, and that can be given. So in relation to that, do you have a next ideal, Ben? I know what mine is if you don't.
Go for it.
I'm in a bunch of other Discord servers with a lot of other Cosmere-focused people, and we have a Discord server if you are a supporter of the Next Ideal on Patreon, a supporter-exclusive Discord server. You'd like to talk about Next Ideals there. But I'm in another Discord server that has a daily question just to spur conversation between the people there. And one of them this past week was, what do you do when you are feeling sad or depressed to get you out of it? A lot of people are like, oh, well, I have this playlist of songs that I listen to, or I do this, I crochet, or, do these specific activities to get myself out of depressive funks and start feeling better. And I read that question, and my first thought was, I don't know. Having that realization of, what do I do when I'm in a depressive funk to get out of it? Wallow? It's one of those unhealthy coping mechanisms. So my next ideal, and it relates to what we talked about in this chapter, is I want to find that stance. I'm going to spend some time and figure out what are those things that would be helpful to get me back in stance when I'm knocked out of it. When I am having a depressive funk, and when I am feeling self-critical and ideating, what are those things I can do to consciously get out of it rather than just wallowing, which is what I've done for too many years?
I think that's great. We'll actually talk a little bit more about that in our next episode. I think there's some things that I think will relate there, but I think that's a great place to start. For me, my next ideal is I need to have a conversation with my youngest son. In the Jeppsen family, you don't have to be a soldier to be the best version, but you do have to be a drummer. Or at least I think it might feel that way. I'm a drummer. My oldest daughter is a drummer. And my second child, my son, Ethan, is a drummer. And my youngest child, he's about at the age to start. And I remember a couple of years ago, I asked him, what do you want to do? He said, I want to play the trumpet. And I was like, really? You're not going to be a drummer? And now lately he says he's a drummer. And I'm realizing I think I've set up some conditions of worth. And so I'm going to have, my next ideal is I'm going to have a conversation and try and I'll be like Dalinar and say, there are other ways, But if you want, I can buy you a drum set. No, I'm not going to do that.
Here's some shard plate. But also you can do whatever you want. But here's some shard plate.
Make sure that he really does want to be a drummer and help him explore all kinds of other opportunities if he wants.
Excellent.
Anybody, if you're hearing or watching this in a place where you can leave a comment, we would love to hear what your next ideals would be in response to this episode. Any thoughts that you have about what we talked about and how you want to try and maybe change your life in response.
Ben mentioned that there will be probably further discussion on some of these concepts in the next episode. If you are a supporter of The Next Ideal on Patreon, you can listen to that next episode right now. Supporters on Patreon have access to early episodes, have access to the spoiler discussions that we excise from these episodes because we want it to be a spoiler-free read-along podcast. So if you support us on Patreon, like the amazing Revelry Play, who is a supporter at the highest tier on our Patreon, you can get access to all of that information, even our episode outlines and our research notes you can get a look at. There is all of that stuff available for people who want to keep working for those next ideals.